9/11, 2001, the tragic and horrific attack by extremists on New York, Washington, D.C., and of course, the plane that didn't get to Washington, D.C., that fell in the cornfields of Pennsylvania. For people of Muslim faith, they look at 9/11 as before and after, how their lives were before 9/11 and how their lives have been after. Hate crimes against Muslim Americans increased over 1,600% in the years 2001 and 2002. It slowly declined, but it really didn't level off until 2004 through 2016. For most Americans, Islam before 9/11 was sort of a curiosity. It was the least threatening religion. And then all of a sudden, after 9/11, it became, in many people's minds, the most threatening religion without any real data to back those views up. All of that changed when close to 3,000 individuals of all races and all religions died in the tragic attack and then the collapse of the Twin Towers in New York City. It was the worst attack on the continental United States since World War II. They became targets because of their race. They became targets because of their culture, their religion, and their dress. The group within the Muslim community that may have actually suffered the most verbal frustration at them were Muslim women. Women who, by their choices, wore the headscarves and wore other parts of what they felt provided them the dignity of their culture and their faith. A story began to filter through the press and America that somehow this was a plan by terrorists to create and to destroy our Constitution and create Sharia law throughout the United States and destroy our way of life. This then was leading to the formation of a word, Islamophobia. And that word caught on not only among intellectuals and professors and media, but beyond the word that the average American may not use. It began to be used in movies and television shows and the networks. The United States, of course, retaliated against Al Qaeda and bin Laden by bombing and sending troops to Afghanistan.
Hello again, everyone. This is Candace Crystal, the Artistic Director from American History Theater. I have with me today Lily Mojdehi, along with Noon Abdelaziz from Breaking Down Barriers. So I'll have each of you introduce yourselves, and hopefully I didn't butcher the names too bad. Lily, why don't we start with you and what you do at Breaking Down Barriers?
Okay, beautiful. Hello, I'm Lili Mojdehi. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Middle Eastern Outreach Coordinator. I say Middle Eastern, but we're trying to move towards saying Southwest Asian because it's more inclusive and geographically accurate. So I might be saying Southwest Asian and North African or Southwest Asian throughout this presentation.
Excellent. And Noon, what about you?
Hello, my name is Noon, and I am the Outreach Coordinator for the Refugee and African Refugee Community at the Breaking Down Barriers program. I am a past refugee myself. I'm from Sudan, but I grew up in Egypt, and I came to the United States when I was about 10 years old.
Awesome. Well, I'm so excited to have you both here. And I know we are talking about September 11th with you all. So I guess I'll start with you, Lily. How do you feel September 11th shaped America today?
So first I would just like to say that first and foremost, I want to acknowledge and all the lives that were lost on that day in the Pentagon and in New York City with the Twin Towers, and all the families that continue to mourn their loved ones who were killed that day. And yeah, I just want to start off by saying that. And then secondly, for me, my family is from Iran. So my family immigrated here because of the Iranian Revolution. So we've been here for about 30 plus years. And to me, when I think of 9/11, I think, okay, I associate it with the US going to war with Iraq. And I also associate it with my identity being tied to terrorism, basically my Iranian identity being tied to this identity of terrorism, and terrorists come from that region of the world. So 9/11 has impacted the US in an incredible amount of ways, by how our security systems are, by how we move through the airports now, by adding counterterrorism and anti-terrorism units to our police forces, adding homeland security, and of course going to war with Iraq has impacted Iraqi people mostly, and has impacted what immigration looks like in the US. So people traveling to and from their countries, people trying to come to the US for refuge, immigration, asylum seeking is way more difficult than it was before. So yeah, I just remember when I was in kindergarten when 9/11 happened, so I was really young, or I was in first grade. And my best friend looked at me when my first grade teacher told me that we were going to war in Iraq, and she was like, "Are you okay?" Because she knows that where I'm from and how proud I was of like my country of origin. And I was like, I'm just so worried about my family, which is just really funny for me to think about now, because I don't have any family in Iraq. And Iraq is a neighboring country with Iran, and I barely have family anymore in Iran. But as a child, that's how I was feeling. I was like feeling connected to that region of the world and very worried about people there, which was honestly wise if I think about it now.
Empathy there from your first grade kindergarten self. And I do think that that is a deep conversation we can have with people, how it was almost like you have to dim your culture because you don't want people to know that, because everyone just assumed this whole group of people were terrorists. And it was really and truly terrible. And I can only imagine being a child during that time, even Middle Eastern or Southwest Asian descent, to be like, what's wrong with us? Because that's just kids and how they internalize. So I'm really sorry about that. We're working on America, slowly but surely.
Yeah, for sure. President Bush like deemed a huge region of the world as the axis of evil. And I think that has just impacted how a lot of people racially identify. Like their connection with their religion has become a part of how they are raced, how they look, if they look like they are from a region of the world where terrorism is associated with that, how they move through their body in the US has completely changed. Their comfortability expressing their religion, their comfortability speaking their language out loud, especially in an airport or something like that, has completely changed.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious, Noon, because when we first started talking about the events we wanted to discuss for continuing the conversation, I know you and Lily were like, hey, we want to do this one jointly. So on the flip side of it, can we talk about how 9/11 affected the African refugee community a bit?
Yeah, of course. I think to add on to a lot of the things that Lily said, on top of the identity of being like, Muslim, it was also the identity of being African or Black. And that was already something that, was kind of a challenge to maneuver through. Even like before 9/11 happened, I think these problems were very much prevalent, but that event kind of highlighted it a little bit more, just due to the fear that people held on to. And people in office using really problematic language to describe people made the rest of the nation fear them like even more. And from fear, we all know a lot of violence and, you know, horrible things happen because, you know, you always try to protect yourself and your neighborhoods. So on top of that identity of like wearing the hijab or identifying as a Muslim person, you had to wear, you know, the color of your skin. And so it was like, you know, all these identities topping on top of each other. And for some communities, I think since I'm from North Africa, so I would be considered Afro-Arab, but I kind of identify as African. So I'd be considered Middle Eastern because I'm Sudanese, and that's like in the northern parts of Africa. And so a lot of times people would strip down their identity to kind of fit into, you know, the average or the decency like of what being a person would be. And I've noticed that within the Middle Eastern community within itself, they would, you know, strip down their identity to being European, or like, oh, I'm not, you know, fully Iranian, I'm actually, you know, part Caucasian. So they don't take that heaviness that comes with, you know, the label of being a terrorist or being Muslim, and people had to denounce their religion. And how it looked like for the African refugee community, it looked like, you know, skin bleaching actually occurred because people wanted to look lighter. They didn't want to look darker. And those were problems, again, that happened before 9/11, but now it's more prevalent because people didn't want to identify as one thing. Like they got attacked in the streets. People were, like there was a whole day dedicated. I remember in high school, I couldn't go to school for 2 days because there was a, what's it called? Attack a Muslim Day. And so if you were found walking in the street, someone could pull your hijab, or someone can throw tear gas at you, or, you know, any chemical basically to harm you. And so, you know, you can, like, for example, if you're Muslim, you can remove your hijab, but you can never remove your skin color. And so those two identities, like, playing a big role in how America already perceived us as people was very, very heavy. And the community that I grew up in, which is City Heights, is predominantly, you know, full of BIPOC folks, and it has a lot of mosques and, you know, a few churches, and it's very diverse within its, like, spiritual practices. And it is very, very heavily monitored, because the people who live in these communities are Black, are Muslim, are, you know, or identify as Middle Eastern. And so, you know, within that identity, our communities became a target. And within the policy changes that happened after 9/11, that greatly reflected to today's society, because, you know, a lot of these policies didn't, you know, exist before, and they were created to kind of monitor the surveillance, or like the, to prevent future events like that from happening. But, you know, it's one thing to intent something, and the intention doesn't always come off that way. And so these policies actually affected predominantly our communities, because, you know, the security in the airport targeted, you know, we all know they targeted certain groups of people, even though it was the security of all.
Right.
Yeah. And, you know, there is a whole CVE situation that happened, and I think Lily can talk more about that because she has more knowledge around it. But there was a whole CVE situation where, you know, folks wanted to put lights with cameras within our neighborhoods to watch our neighborhoods. And there was several arrests that happened to imams just because they were doing fundraisers in our community to send back to Somalia during the time of the famine and the war that was happening. And those folks were arrested because they were labeled as terrorists, sending resources back home to help, you know, terrorist organizations. But in fact, they were raising money to help folks and aid them back home. You know, things like speed bumps were built like next to mosques, so when you're driving by, you would slow down, and like cops could slow down and like look over and, you know, take their time within those areas. And it's just a lot of little things that happened that affected our communities. And within the Somali, the Sudanese, the you know, Bantu is part of Somalia as well. But all those regions within, you know, the African diaspora who identified as Muslims had a very, very hard time, even on top of being Black or, you know, darker hued than other folks. It just became amplified. Like the fear itself became, you know, a very heavy thing to hold as well.
Right. Yeah. It's It's so crazy because I never saw it like that
Mm,
until later in life. You know, I was sixth grade when when 9/11 happened. And it was one of those things where I didn't even realize the struggle that not even just the, if you will, Middle Eastern, Southwest Asian community had, but the African refugee community. I didn't really have an experience with the African refugee community until I came to San Diego. And
mm,
it's so alarming that these are things that we're not learning in school. These are things we're not being told about because, oh, it's othering. It's just over there. It doesn't happen here.
mm,
But it does. It's happening in our own backyard. And that's
mm,
part of why this continuing the conversation is so important. We want to understand more about our neighbors. We want to understand more about our friends and how we can be better allies and have better understandings. So,
mm,
with Breaking Down Barriers focus on mental health and mental well-being, I would love if you each could talk a little bit about the effect that 9/11 had on the mental well-being of the people in your affected communities. And I guess we'll start with Lily on this one again. You know, how do you feel that 9/11 and all the Islamophobia, if you will, what effect did that have on the Middle Eastern, Southwest Asian community?
Mhm. Okay, like Noon said, I think it's always important to just say that Islamophobia, xenophobia did not start after 9/11, just like racism didn't start after Trump was elected or something like that. Um, and for the longest time, the East or people from Southwest Asia and North Africa have been looked at as other and less than and uncivilized and barbaric, all of these negative words. So when I think of the mental wellness of people from Southwest Asia, it is very hard to research or get any sort of statistics about mental health and people from that region, which tells you something like a big region, a big population is under researched when it comes to mental health. I think partly because people from that region are still considered white on the census, and because there's just still a huge stigma with talking about mental health and mental wellness in these communities. But the studies that I have found, they usually always are case studies of Arabs, usually in Michigan. There's a large Arab population in Michigan. And it's not always, but largely connected to the impact that 9/11 had on the mental wellness on Arab Americans. And we will see a rise in depression, and we've seen a rise in anxiety, especially with Arab youth after 9/11, which is directly linked to the hate crimes that they're experiencing, the bullying that they're experiencing, just an overall sense of insecurity when walking outside. So just like feeling safe, feeling secure, feeling confident in your identity is absolutely going to impact your mental wellness and mental health. And I would also just say for so many people in the Southwest Asian and North African community, having an identity crisis after 9/11 of just being confused or feeling insecure about what part of your identity you can explore or express. I think just the feeling of knowing that you have to hide parts of yourself is going to impact your mental health. Because if you're not able to express who you are or even explore who you are, that's going to impact your identity and how you feel safe in your home or how you feel safe outside, and what you think that you can share out loud in a school classroom. It's all just going to, it takes a toll on you. It just takes a toll on you knowing that you have to hide certain things, especially for youth, like growing up and discovering who they are, you know?
Yeah, it's tough. You watch them and they want to be proud of their cultures, but that fear, and I always say it's like dimming their own light, and it's so unfortunate.
Mm-hmm.
Noon, I'd love your take too on the mental well-being of the African refugee community, and you know, between both 9/11 to present day,
mm.
how has it affected them?
On the mental capacity, I think I'll even kind of build on what Lily said around identity. That was a huge one. Again, I mentioned it earlier, but not being able to explore yourself fully, and the walking into a room and having to water down yourself as a person, that within itself is very traumatic. And Black women, I'm gonna speak for Black women real quick, and how that identity within itself is triggering within our society, because we're viewed as angry, we're viewed as too much, we're viewed, we're carried into a light. Even if we walk into a doctor's office, our bodies are not treated in the same light as other folks, just because we're expected to be strong at all times. And that plays a big role in mental health, because even if you do want to take care of yourself for one day, you feel this guilt within your heart because you're expected to be strong and carry your community. And Black women are always expected to carry their communities, even within a lot of hardship. And within the refugee journey, not only do they have to take care of their families, make sure everyone's safe, they neglect themselves throughout the journey. And when they come into a space where they have to water down their identity and silence themselves, even though they have a lot of anger and sadness within their heart, that triggers, kind of an accumulation of emotions, and it's never explored, and it's never given space to kind of uh, get out. And so it could look like a big explosion at the end, because or an episode or whatever, however that looks like within our communities. And I had a session, with a BDB session with a lot of mothers within our communities. It was a African refugee mother session around mental health and stigma, and we talked about historical trauma. And the things that they told me was just so upsetting, and I was just so confused why there was never a space for them to kind of explore these things that they went through. And it's because their identity as people, that they have a hijab on, that they're Muslim, that they're Black, and they're women. And all of like the medical racism that they had to go through, the spaces that kind of look down upon them as people just because they're supposed to be viewed as strong, was just so upsetting, because they're people. Like, there's no if or. And I remember like 6th grade, when I came to, like, when I was starting 6th grade, I started in 5th grade when I came to the United States. And before I got into the bus going to school, my dad, I'd expect he'd be like, have a good day or whatever. But he told me, like, if anyone asks you at school, just say that you're not fully Muslim, you're half Catholic, because my grandmother's side did identify as Catholic. And so just talk to them about that. And if they ask you about Osama bin Laden, just say you don't know anything about it. And if they ask you about your race, just say you're part Arab and you don't know anything else. And the fact that I was taught at a very young age to like water down myself as a form of survival tactic just shows, like, as an example, how other students had to go through that just because their identity and like the trauma that it holds. And you never are given space to explore parts of yourself because you're too afraid to. And even if you are Muslim, sometimes you have to denounce your religion because you're constantly fed things that might not be true, but you have to take it in, because if you argue, you're going to be seen as extreme. Versus, a Caucasian church girl at your school could be talking about how great Jesus is at all times, like, oh, I went to a recruit this week or whatever it is, and freely expressing their religious perspective without being judged. But when you say anything, you're questioned, you are dehumanized, you're called a terrorist or too extreme of a person. And so the double standards that it plays, and even within the race category and the refugee category, being called things like an African booty scratcher because you're from Africa, and a lot of people didn't want to identify as African for the longest time. Even Black students within our school bullied African refugee students, because that was their way of gaining back their power, of being like, oh, I'm not African, I'm just African American. And so that whole identity of like not being enough for one group or the other, you're not Muslim enough, you're not African enough, you're not American enough, you're not enough of anything, and not feeling whole, that takes a very, very heavy toll on your mental health, because you can never fit a certain thing, and you never are given space to explore anything but these two options. So where do you go from there? And so like the mental health of our community definitely needs a lot of space to like uh, explore those conversations and time to heal, because it's a lot of things that we don't talk about, still don't talk about, because we're not given the space to, and because of these labels that we're put into as a community.
Yeah, I definitely think educating the community is a great starting point, and especially when kids. We're in
Mm-hmm.
here, and I really am a firm believer in helping the community in any way we can. So,
Mm-hmm.
with that,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'll start with Lily on this one. If someone wanted to reach out to you or find more information on their community, where would you send them? What would be some really great options for our viewers?
I would first send them to our Instagram. Honestly, it's at bdb.sd, because each one of us, the 7 outreach coordinators, has our own resource list available. And we constantly post any resources that we find about mental health, or, we're firm believers that if people don't have safe housing, food security, and just like community support and health, then they can talk about their mental health, or all of those conversations have to align. So we post food resources, we post housing resources, we post a lot of different resources all on our Instagram and on our stories. So I would send them there.
Perfect. They wanted to reach you directly.
They can reach me at lilym@jfssd.org.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And June, same question for you. If anyone needed some resources, where would you send them?
Definitely the Instagram, and I'd say this just because we do IGTV lives every week are surrounding different conversations like this that affect our communities directly as it relates to mental health. So a few weeks ago, we did activism burnout or activism fatigue and mental health stigma, and how that looked like in our communities, just because during these times, you find a lot of our community members out, protesting, doing what they can to survive, basically. And so we wanted to bring light to that conversation while still surrounding it back to mental health. And so that's an example of the type of conversations that we hold that are important to our communities. So our IGTV lives, we invite community members to come talk with us and hold like a panel discussion basically about things that we should talk about, which is another way of holding space for them. And also for them to watch it after and to kind of, gain new information and resources. And we try to interview therapists and, community local community resources, so they get that as well. And as Lily mentioned, we all have like a tree of resources for our own community, so they can always get plugged into that. And within our Instagram feed, we always post mental health resources and like really cool infographics that can kind of educate you around mental health and stigma. And then on top of that, they can also reach out to our JFS website. I forgot the website's name, but I'll send it to you. But I'm pretty sure it's
That'll
BDB
be
dot.
the description.
Yeah, it's very simple. And then my email is noon, NOUNA, at jfssd.org.
Awesome. Awesome. I so appreciate you both for being here, and I'm hoping our viewers out there did learn something new. And if they didn't learn something new, you found some new resources, because this is such an important conversation. And I know we can't do it all right here, right now, but we are trying our best to make the conversation stick and to keep it going for as long as we can. So thank you both again for being here.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Candace.
you.
This was great.
Absolutely.
And the tragedy is that sometimes many of these perceptions have been pushed strictly for political reasons, not for national security. Our military and our FBI and Homeland Security have said it this year in 2020 that overwhelmingly the number one fear of their departments for internal terrorism is by white supremacist groups.